Hey, I'm Dan Thomas, and welcome to my channel for the Newbie Woodworker. Or anyone, really. I'm going to show you how to make custom base plates for your router, in detail, so if you've never done something like this before, I've got you covered. I'll be making an oversized square base plate that helps keep your router stable when you route on the edge of something. In a round base plate, you can turn 360 degrees while routing. Both of them are symmetrical, so no matter which way you turn them, they still cut the same distance from a straight edge. And I'll show you two different methods for getting the screw holes in the right place. One that uses your existing base plate as a template, and one that uses your router base by itself in case you don't have a base plate at all. So let's get started. I'll be demonstrating with two different routers. My Makita trim router, which has a round base except for this flat part here, which is for the edge guide attachment. And my Harbor Freight trim router, which has a rectangular base with odd dimensions. The bit is centered from side to side, but not from front to back. The methods I'll be showing you should work equally well for a full-size router. One last thing before we get into it. If you're not from the yellow section of this map in the upper left, then listen up. I'll be talking about 1/4-inch bits and shafts throughout this video. If you have metric shafts, just know that I'm talking about a shaft around 6 millimeters. So replace that with the size of your shaft. When I talk about a 1/4-inch bit, I mean a bit the same size as your shaft. And if I talk about a 1/4-inch rod, I'm talking about a rod the same size as your shaft. I'm going to build the oversized square base plate first, but make sure you watch this even if you only want a round base plate. My stock base plate is 3.5 inches in diameter. Start out by making your workpiece at least an inch wider than your stock base plate all around, even if you don't want an oversized base plate, and make it perfectly square. You can cut it down later if you want something smaller. So in my case, that makes it 5.5 inches square. The first thing we need is a center hole, and if we want our base plate to be symmetrical, we need this hole to be as close to the exact center as possible. Since I know my workpiece is square, I can use the center finder to find the exact middle. Use a sharp pencil and draw as close to the plastic as possible. If you don't have a center finder, you can just use a ruler to draw from corner to corner, but I always find it's hard to get that right, so that's why I prefer using a tool like this. Besides, when you use the center finder and you draw 4 lines, if the lines aren't right on top of each other, you know something's wrong. Either the length and width are different, or the corners aren't 90 degrees. Like I said, we need this hole to be as close to exactly centered as possible, so I recommend marking the center with a sharp screw or something similar. It's easier to be exact this way, and then you can use a punch if you want. Now drill the center hole the same size as your router bit shafts. My router takes 1/4-inch shafts, so I'm using a 1/4-inch drill bit. Be as careful as possible to get the drill bit right in the center. If your router can take larger shafts, but you have a collet adapter for something smaller, use a smaller one. The next step is to figure out where the screw holes go. So start by putting a router bit the same diameter as your center hole into your router and stick it in the hole. We need something to prop it up on. I made this simple stand, but you can use any method you want. The height depends on how long your bit is. In my case, I took 3 pieces of scrap 3/4-inch plywood and glued them together using CA glue and activator. I could have used long screws or even nails if I wanted to, but we're going to use CA glue later on, so I thought I'd use it here. CA glue is pretty much any glue that says it's super glue. You can get the activator at most woodworking stores or online. Put a couple of drops of glue on one surface, spray the other surface with activator, press it together for 10 seconds or so, and it's glued together. Then I drilled a big hole near the center, so I had a place to stick my bit. When you put the bit in the router, have the shaft sticking up above the base plate, because that's the part of the bit that'll fit most snugly in the hole. See? I can barely get it out. So here's the trick for marking where to drill the screw holes. Get 4 blocks of scrap wood about an inch wide or so. We're going to position them so they're snug against the base plate. You might need thinner blocks so they touch the base plate, not the base. Place painter's tape around the sides of the workpiece so it's outside where the base plate goes. You might want to outline the base plate first. Put painter's tape on one side of each of the 4 blocks. I'm drawing an arrow so I know which way the base plate will be facing. I'll show you why in a moment. Now put a couple of drops of CA glue on the tape on the workpiece, spray accelerator on the tape on a block, then quickly slide it against the base plate, and hold it down for 10 seconds or so. You could use double-side tape for this, but CA glue gives you a second or two to slide the block next to the base plate before the glue sets. Then add the other 3 blocks the same way, making sure they're butted up against the base plate too. If you make a mistake, just take off the tape and do it again. Once the 4 blocks are glued in place, you can remove the router. Then remove your stock base plate and put it back between the blocks. This is why I put the arrow here. If you put the base plate back the wrong way, the screw holes might not end up lining up properly. Trust me, I know.
What the? Why doesn't that fit?
It should fit in between the blocks so it doesn't move around. If it moves around, you need to do it again. As I said earlier, make sure your blocks touch the base plate, not the base. I recommend using a self-centering punch to mark the center of each screw hole. It's very important to get these as close to correct as possible. You normally hit the punch with a mallet, but I can't seem to hit it square on the head, which means some of the punch marks won't end up in the center. So instead, I just press it down with my glove-covered thumb. Later on, I got smarter and used a small block of wood. It makes just enough of an indentation that I'll be able to feel it, and I mark it with a pencil so I know where to feel for it. Then remove the blocks and tape. And I use a punch on the indentations. If your router screws have heads with countersunk bottoms like these, then you need to drill countersunk holes for them. There's a lot of ways to do that, but I really like this countersink drill bit set from Snappy I got recently. It's got a nice depth stop collar, so I won't drill the countersink all the way through the MDF, but drill them deep enough so the screw head will go below the surface. My countersink drill bit isn't large enough, so I drilled the holes out with a larger bit that matches my router base's holes. I'm being careful to let the cone-shaped head of the bit keep it centered in the existing holes. For flat-bottom screw heads, you need to drill counterbore holes. This works best with a bit like a brad point bit or a Forstner bit because they make the bottom of the hole flat, but do the best you can with what you've got. Make this hole wider than the screw head. Again, drill down deep enough so the screw head will go below the surface, although you can fix this later if you need to. Then finish drilling with a bit larger than the width of your screws. Now put it on the router base to make sure the screw holes are in the right place. And mine are. If yours aren't, figure out what you did wrong and try it again. Yep, I'm full of helpful tips. Now put the base on your router over the 1/4-inch bit to make sure the center hole is still aligned with the bit. If it isn't, you probably made the same mistake I did, not taking into account the way the base plate should be facing when you put it back in between the blocks. If you discover your base plate has some wiggle room, then once your base plate fits correctly over the router bit, glue down some small blocks next to the base so you can get it back on in the right place later on. The only thing left is to drill out the center of the base plate. My stock base plate's hole is a little shy of 1 1/4 inches, so I'll use a 1 1/4 inch Forstner bit for this. You don't have to be exactly in the center of the existing hole here, but try to be as close as possible. If you want to cut your base plate down to a smaller size, now's probably a good time to do it. Let's say I want to cut this 5.5-inch base plate down to 3.5 inches. That means I need to cut 1 inch off of each side. So I set my fence to 4.5 inches. Try to be as accurate as you can with your fence. I numbered the sides just so I don't get confused. Then I cut 1 inch off of 2 sides. Now I set my fence to 3.5 inches and cut 1 inch off the remaining 2 sides, which gives me a 3.5-inch square base plate, assuming I set the fence correctly. Here's a thicker one I made off camera. It's probably a good idea to do some sanding. 120 grit seems to work well here, for me. Now put your new base plate on the router. I actually don't recommend using a drill to screw the base plate into the router. It's too easy to over-tighten it and ruin something. But I'm only driving the screws partway in, and I've got the clutch set to 1 in case I mess up, so I'm okay with it. Still, do as I say, not as I'm doing. Finish tightening the screws in a sort of star-like pattern to make sure they tighten even. So here's how you'll use your new symmetrical base plate. Let's say this is the line that you want to cut on with your router. You'll need to clamp a straight edge parallel to this line, the right distance away so the center of the router bit will cut right on the line. The key number here is half the width of your base plate. Since my base plate is 5.5 inches wide, the key distance for me is 2 3/4 inches. So I draw a line parallel to the cut line exactly 2 3/4 inches away. Then clamp a straight edge on this line, and when you run your router along the straight edge, you'll cut right in the center of the target line. It's as simple as that. With a symmetrical base plate, the straight edge always goes half the width of the base plate away. Now get a piece of scrap wood so you can do some test cuts. Obviously, I've used this piece before. Draw your cut line, then draw your straight edge line, remember, half the width of your base plate away, and clamp down a straight edge right on that line. Don't forget to set your bit depth. You don't need to cut very deep. I'm hanging my dust collection hose from my ceiling mount, and then I attach the dust shroud to my router. Cut a little using each edge of the base plate so you can make sure they're all the same distance. I can't use the last edge because the dust collection is in the way. That's why I made that thicker base plate I showed you a few minutes ago. Then check the results. If you did everything right, each cut should be centered on the line. If they aren't,
I always do that. I always mess up some mundane detail.
check the mundane details. We're going to build a round base plate in this section. As I said earlier, you won't need a removable base plate to position the screw holes. So first, you need to figure out what size screws your router base uses. If you don't already know the screw size, you might find it online. Or stores like Home Depot have gauges that let you figure out screw sizes. But another option is a thread checker, like this one. It has both metric and imperial measurements. You can check the threads of a screw using the open ends of these gauges. Mine's actually an M4 with a 0.7 thread pitch. If you don't have the screws, you can use the other end and screw it into the hole on your base. This is the only thing I don't like about having these on a wire, but at least I won't lose them as easily. So buy some screws that fit your base, and they should be at least 1 inch long. Mine are 30 millimeters. Then cut the heads off. Then put the screw in your drill and tighten it down. Not too much, of course, and make sure it doesn't wobble. I'm putting the drill in reverse and using my belt sander to make a point. Since the bit is spinning, it makes it easier to get the point close to the middle. If you don't have a belt sander, you can still put it in your drill like this, but you'll need to run it against a file or even some coarse sandpaper, along with some patience. Then I flatten 2 sides near the tip so I can use pliers on it if I need to. You might not end up needing this. Now that we don't need to put it in the drill anymore, cut off the extra so it isn't too long. And clean up the end, but hopefully you'll do a better job of it than I did. And obviously, make 4 of them. I'm making the round base out of 3/4 inch plywood. I know that's kind of thick, but I want to raise my dust port up as high as possible so I can clear the clamps on a straight edge. I'm starting with a 5.5 inch square, same as before, except I'll be cutting this down to 3.5 inches before I'm done. So mark the center like before, although this one doesn't need to be exactly in the center. I'm making the circle cutting jig from a piece of 1/4 inch MDF, 4 inches by 6 inches, although the exact dimensions don't really matter. I'll be using a 1/4 inch router bit. Put the hole for the router bit far enough from the end so your router fits on the jig. For me, it's about 2 inches in and relatively centered. Next, we need the hole that the jig will pivot on to cut the circle. Here's the simple formula. Half the size of the circle you want to cut, plus half the size of the router bit you'll use. I want a 3.5 inch circle, so half that is 1 3/4 inches. I'm using a 1/4 inch bit, and half that is 1/8 of an inch, which means my pivot hole needs to be 1 7/8 inch from the center of the router bit hole. So mark and punch the holes for the circle jig. Then drill the 2 holes in the circle jig and the center hole in the workpiece. I should point out that it's pretty important to drill these holes straight up and down. I drilled them once with a handheld drill and not very straight, and it ended up biting me in the base plate. Now put the screws in the base, which is easier said than done with my fat fingers. Tips up, of course. It might be hard to get them started in the holes, so you may need to file down the ends a little. Make sure they're pretty much even by trying to tip the base from side to side, then adjusting them as needed. This is important, so take your time and get it right. For the next steps, you could use the shaft of a 1/4-inch router bit, but router bits have a tendency to jump out and bite me, so I decided to cut a pin from a piece of 1/4-inch round rod with an angle grinder. This one ends up being too short, so later I'll cut a longer one. Put the pin in your router, or you could use a 1/4-inch bit like before. Then put on the base with the pointed screws. Now put the circle jig over the pin. Make sure all 4 screw points make contact with the jig. Here's what happened when I didn't drill the holes perpendicular to the jig. Use a rubber mallet or something similar to tap on the jig where the screws are. You don't need to tap hard, just enough to let the pointed screws leave their marks. Then I used a pencil to darken the marks, and I circled them so they'll show up on the camera. We're going to start making the screw holes by drilling through both the circle jig and the new base plate at the same time. So put some double-sided tape on the circle jig, or you could do the same thing with painter's tape, CA glue, and activator. Put the pin or 1/4-inch bit in the hole in the base plate, and put the jig over the pin so they're aligned correctly, and press it down. Start out by using a small bit to drill holes through both pieces. Then unstick them, and countersink or counterbore the screw holes in both workpieces, one at a time, like I showed with the square base plate. For this thick base plate, I'm using a larger drill bit to make deep countersunk holes. They're technically not counterbored holes because the bottom of the hole isn't flat. It's shaped like a countersink to work with my countersunk screw heads. I have to check it a few times until I get the depth right. Then I can drill the other 3 countersinks. Countersunks? Countersinks. Whatever. Take the pointed screws out of the base. Try attaching the base plate to make sure it fits right. Then remove it. I'm going to use this 1/4-inch spiral upcut router bit to cut the circle. I love this bit. Now attach the circle jig. We need to screw the workpiece down to some scrap wood so it doesn't move when we use the circle jig. So mark where you'll be drilling out the center later, because this is a good spot for some screws. Put 2 screws in the corners and 2 inside the center, so nothing moves when the circle has been cut. Along the way, I realized my pivot pin wasn't long enough, so I cut a longer one off camera. So put the pin in the workpiece, or you could use something like the shaft of a 1/4-inch bit. And that's how it'll work. I'm going to show where I cut the circle with my Harbor Freight router, because the video I shot when I used my Makita router didn't come out very well. You'll probably need to drill a deeper 1/4-inch hole for the pivot pin. Because the MDF is so thin, I could cut the circle in 1 pass, but when I cut the thicker one for the Makita router, I did it in 3 passes. This came out well, but now I'm going to switch back to the other video. And here's the result. Obviously, these screws kept the workpiece from moving, but once the cut was complete, this part could have started to move before I turned off the router, and it might have gotten gouged by the router bit. Trust me on this. So that's why I added these screws. I'm not worried about the holes because I'm going to drill this part out in a moment. When I made a round base plate from my Harbor Freight router, I kept the screws loose until I got it over the bit, then tightened them down. Then I glued 4 small blocks against the base so I wouldn't have any trouble getting it back on in the right position later on. Don't forget to do some sanding, and as I mentioned earlier, 120 grit worked well for me. Put the new base plate on the router and check to see that it looks centered. I'm using the 1/4" Forstner bit from before to drill out the center hole. It doesn't need to be perfectly centered, but try to be close. So like we did before, get a piece of scrap wood and draw a cut line. Then draw the line for the straight edge half the size of your base plate from the cut line. Then clamp down the straight edge right on the line. You're going to want to spin the router at one point so you can make sure the base plate is centered properly, so draw an arrow somewhere where you'll do this. Although as you'll see, I screwed this up. You don't need to cut very deep. I set my router to about 1/4 inch, and that's plenty. Then start to cut along the straight edge. You want to keep the router flat against the workpiece, contrary to what I'm doing here. When you get to your arrow, spin it around, but keep the router against the straight edge, which I did not do here. Then continue along the line. I had to do the spinny thing again, and this time I actually did keep the router against the straight edge. Stop before you cut it all the way across, and turn off your router before you remove it. Then take a look at how you did. You can see here how the cut is right on the center line, so that means my base plate is the right size. And somewhere around here is where I spun the router around the second time, and you can't tell exactly where, so that means the base plate is centered on the router. In upcoming videos, I'll show you how to make a really simple edge guide jig, and an adjustable routing template that really rocks. Don't forget you can find product links in the description below and on my website. If this video was helpful, please give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment if you want to, subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to ring that bell so you'll be notified when I release new videos. Thanks!